She didn't knock, didn't call out, didn't even move. Just stood there in the last stretch of dying light like she'd been carved out of the same dust that covered Ethan Cole's land. And the strange thing wasn't the woman, or even the child pressed close against her side. It was the feeling that she had been there long before he noticed, waiting, watching, like time itself had slowed down just for her to arrive, and Ethan, who had lived alone for 12 years and trusted nothing that showed up, unannounced, felt something shift deep in his chest that he couldn't name, not fear, not yet, but close enough to make his hand hover near the doorframe instead of reaching for the handle. Because out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, people didn't just appear at your doorstep without reason, not at sundown, not carrying silence that heavy, and certainly not with a child who held a small silver pendant so tightly it caught the last rays of sunlight and sent a sharp glint straight into Ethan's eyes, a glint that felt familiar in a way he didn't like a memory half buried and better left that way. And the wind moved slow across the open land, carrying the dry scent of sage and old wood, brushing against the woman's dark hair without her reacting, not a single strand shifting out of place more than necessary, as if even the wind respected her stillness. And the child, no older than 6, maybe 7, didn't cry, didn't speak, just looked up at Ethan with eyes too steady for someone that small, eyes that didn't ask for help, didn't beg, didn't fear, only waited. And that waiting did something to him, something quiet but undeniable, because he had seen desperation before, seen it in men, in animals, in himself once upon a time. But this wasn't desperation. This was something else, something controlled, something chosen, and it made the air between them feel tight, like a held breath stretching too long. And Ethan finally stepped forward, boots crunching lightly over the dirt, stopping a good 10 feet from the edge of his porch, far enough to keep distance, close enough to see the way the woman's shoulders squared slightly as he moved, not defensive, not aggressive, just aware, like someone who measured every step in a world that didn't give second chances. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that settled deep, heavy, not empty but full of things unsaid, until Ethan cleared his throat, low, rough from disuse, and said the only thing that made sense in a place like this. "You lost?" And the woman's eyes met his, dark, steady, unreadable, and she shook her head once, slow, deliberate, before her gaze dropped briefly to the child beside her, then back to him. And in that small movement, Ethan caught something he hadn't expected, a flicker of exhaustion, not physical, not the kind that came from miles on horseback, but something deeper, something carried for longer than a day or a night, and it settled into him without permission, and the child shifted then, just slightly, the silver pendant catching the light again, and Ethan's breath hitched before he could stop it, because he knew that shape, that pattern etched into the metal, simple but unmistakable, something he had seen years ago, in a different place, under different circumstances, back when he still believed certain choices stayed buried, and his eyes lingered on it a second too long, because the woman noticed, of course she did, her gaze following his, and for the first time, something changed in her expression, not much, just a tightening around the eyes, a recognition that passed between them without a single word spoken, and that was when Ethan understood that this wasn't chance, not entirely, and whatever reason had brought her here, it wasn't random. And the wind picked up just enough to rattle the loose hinge on his barn door, a hollow, rhythmic sound that echoed across the quiet land, and Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck, buying himself a second he didn't really have, because out here, hesitation could cost more than a man was willing to pay, and still, he didn't move, not yet, because letting someone in meant more than just opening a door. It meant inviting whatever followed them, whatever history they carried, whatever trouble rode quietly behind their silence. And he had spent too many years building distance from all of that to ignore the weight of it now. And yet, the child took one small step forward, just one, not toward him exactly, but enough to shift the balance of the moment, the pendant resting against their chest like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And Ethan felt that same strange pull tighten again, subtle but persistent, like something old waking up after a long sleep. And before he could think it through, before he could talk himself out of it the way he usually did, he stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the worn wood, hand reaching for the door at his back, and the sound it made when it opened was louder than it should have been, echoing just a little too far into the quiet evening, like the land itself had taken notice. And Ethan didn't look at the woman when he spoke, didn't need to, his voice steady in a way he didn't fully feel. "You can stay the night." And the words hung there, simple, final, heavier than they sounded, because even as he said them, he knew this wasn't just about one night. Not anymore. Not after the way she had looked at him. Not after that pendant caught the light the way it did, and the woman didn't thank him, didn't nod, didn't smile. She just moved, guiding the child forward with a quiet certainty, stepping past him into the dim warmth of the cabin like she had already decided this long before he ever opened the door. And Ethan stood there for a second longer, staring out at the darkening horizon, the last strip of sunlight slipping below the hills, and somewhere in the distance, a faint sound carried on the wind. Hooves, maybe, or just his imagination. But it was enough to make him turn back, toward the doorway, toward the two figures now inside his home, and realize, with a slow, sinking clarity, that whatever had just begun, it wasn't something he could close the door on anymore. The door closed with a dull weight behind them, and for a moment the world outside disappeared, leaving only the quiet crackle of the fire and the soft creak of wood settling into the night. And Ethan stood just inside the threshold, watching as the woman guided the child toward the far side of the room without hesitation, as if she had already mapped every inch of the space in her mind before stepping in. And that alone made something in his chest tighten, because this was his place, his ground, and yet she moved through it like a memory. Returning, not a stranger arriving, and the child stopped near the fire, kneeling down slowly, holding that silver pendant out toward the warmth like it needed the heat, like it had been waiting for this exact moment, and Ethan could not pull his eyes away from it. Not now. Not after seeing it twice in the same breath. And he told himself it was coincidence, that there were hundreds of trinkets that looked the same. That memory played tricks when a man spent too many years alone. But the shape, the curve, the way the light slid across its surface, it pressed against something old in his mind that refused to stay buried. And he turned away before it could settle too deep, crossing the room to grab a spare blanket from the back of a chair, tossing it gently toward them without a word, because words felt wrong in that space, too loud, too sharp, and the woman caught it easily, nodding once, not in thanks, but in acknowledgement, like they were two people exchanging something understood, but never spoken, and she wrapped the child in it, her movements steady, practiced, careful in a way that spoke of long roads and colder nights. And Ethan leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed loosely, watching without appearing to watch, because that was how he had learned to live, observe without stepping in, care without admitting it. And the fire popped softly, sending a small burst of sparks upward, and the child flinched just slightly, tightening their grip on the pendant. And the woman placed a hand on their shoulder, grounding them with a single touch, and it worked instantly, the tension melting away like it had never been there. And Ethan noticed that, too, the quiet authority in that small gesture, the kind that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And outside, the wind shifted direction, pressing lightly against the walls, carrying with it a faint sound that made Ethan's head tilt just enough to listen. Not loud, not clear, but there, distant and uneven, like something moving across open ground. And his eyes flicked toward the window, dark glass reflecting the room back at him instead of revealing what lay beyond. And he pushed himself off the table, stepping closer, just enough to look without making it obvious. But there was nothing, just the outline of his own cabin and the stretch of land fading into night. And still, the feeling remained, subtle but persistent, like a question waiting for an answer. And behind him, the woman spoke for the first time since entering, her voice low, steady, carrying an accent shaped by a different rhythm of language. "They will come." And Ethan did not turn right away, did not ask who, because he already knew the answer without needing it spoken, the same way he knew the sound on the wind was not nothing. And he let out a slow breath, nodding once even though she could not see it. And when he finally looked back at her, she was watching him, not with fear, not with urgency, but with something else entirely, something closer to certainty. Like this moment had already happened somewhere else, and they were just catching up to it. And the child looked between them, quiet, observant, the pendant now resting against their chest, still. no longer searching for warmth, and Ethan felt that pull again. Stronger this time, sharper, like a thread connecting past to present that he had spent years trying to cut, and it made him uneasy in a way that had nothing to do with the approaching riders and everything to do with the way the woman stood there, as if she knew exactly where that thread led. And he pushed off the thought, moving to the corner where his rifle leaned against the wall, not reaching for it, just standing near it. A habit more than a decision, and the woman's eyes followed the movement, not alarmed, not tense, simply aware, and she shook her head once, small, almost imperceptible, and said, "Not for them." And that made him pause, hand hovering near the worn wood, because there was no challenge in her voice, no demand, just a statement, simple and certain, and it unsettled him more than if she had asked him to fight. And he looked at her fully then, really looked, at the way she held herself, at the way the child leaned into her without needing reassurance, at the way the room itself seemed to adjust around her presence. And something inside him shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, like the beginning of understanding that had not yet found its shape. And outside, the faint sound grew just enough to confirm what he had already felt, not imagination, not memory, but something real moving closer. And Ethan straightened slightly, his shoulders settling into a posture he had not used in years, not since before he chose this isolation. And the woman stepped closer to the child, her hand resting lightly on their shoulder again. And for a brief moment, all three of them stood in that small cabin, bound by something none of them had fully named yet, while the night outside carried its quiet approach. And Ethan realized, with a calm that surprised even him, that whatever had followed them here, whatever had brought them to his door in the first place, was no longer just their burden to carry, and that realization did not feel like trouble, not entirely, but like the opening of something he had once closed and never expected to face again. The sound came clearer this time, not loud, not rushed, but steady, measured, like someone who knew exactly where they were going and had no reason to hurry. And Ethan stood still in the middle of the room, listening as the faint rhythm of hooves carried across the dry stretch of land, each step spaced just far enough apart to feel intentional, controlled, and that alone told him more than any sight could, because men who rode like that did not come lost, and they did not come uncertain, and he felt the old instincts rise in him, quiet but sharp, the kind that had kept him alive long before he chose this place, long before he chose to stop choosing at all. And he glanced toward the woman, expecting tension, expecting urgency, but she had not moved, not a single inch, her hand still resting lightly on the child's shoulder, her gaze steady on him like she was waiting for something, not from the riders outside, but from him. And that unsettled him more than the sound itself, because it meant she was not afraid of what was coming, which left only one other possibility, that she understood it better than he did. And Ethan shifted his weight slightly, the floorboard beneath his boot creaking in a way that sounded louder than it should have, and the child turned their head toward the door, not startled, not alarmed, just aware, like they had been expecting this moment all along. And the silver pendant rested quietly against their chest now, no longer catching the firelight, no longer calling attention to itself, but somehow more present than before, like it had already done its part and was now waiting for the rest to unfold. And Ethan felt that thread again, that pull that refused to loosen, and he exhaled slowly, running a hand across his jaw, grounding himself in the familiar roughness of it, in the simple reality of the room, the fire, the walls he had built with his own hands, because whatever this was, whatever had followed them here, it was now standing at the edge of his life whether he wanted it or not. And outside, the sound stopped, not fading, not drifting away, but stopping, right there, just beyond the reach of the cabin, and the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, the kind that pressed against the ears, that filled the space with expectation. And Ethan took one step toward the door, then another, slow, deliberate, each movement measured, not rushed, because rushing meant fear, and he had spent too many years refusing to let fear dictate anything again. And when he reached the door, his hand hovered over the handle, not from hesitation, but from awareness, because once opened, there would be no closing this back to what it was. And behind him, the woman spoke again, softer this time, almost like the words were meant for herself as much as for him. "You already know." And Ethan paused, the weight of that sentence settling into him. Because she was right, he did know, not in words, not in clear thought, but in the way the past had a habit of circling back when a man thought he had outrun it. And he pushed the door open slowly, the wood giving way with a low groan, and the night air slipped in, cool, carrying the scent of dust, and something else, something older, something that did not belong to the town or the roads that led to it. And there, just beyond the edge of the porch, stood a single rider, not three, not a group, just one, sitting tall in the saddle, still as the land itself. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the kind of stillness that did not need to announce itself, that simply existed, and Ethan stepped out onto the porch, boots firm against the worn planks, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the figure before him, the details slow to reveal in the dim light, but enough to see that this was not someone from the town, not someone he had ever traded with or passed on the road. And yet, there was no hostility in the way the rider held themselves, no demand, no urgency, just presence, steady and unyielding. And Ethan felt something shift again, not tension this time, but recognition of a different kind. The kind that came when two paths crossed not by accident, but by something deeper, and the rider inclined their head just slightly. A gesture so small it might have been missed by anyone else. But Ethan saw it, felt it, and behind him, he could sense the woman standing just inside the doorway, not stepping out, not hiding, simply there, part of the moment without needing to claim it. And the child remained by the fire, quiet, waiting, as if this meeting had already been decided long before any of them arrived here. And the rider spoke then, their voice low, calm, carrying across the short distance without effort, words in a language Ethan did not fully understand, but the tone carried meaning all the same, not accusation, not threat, but acknowledgement. And Ethan glanced back over his shoulder for just a second, catching the woman's eyes. And in that look, everything aligned in a way that did not need explanation. The pendant, the silence, the certainty she carried, the way she had said stay, as if it was not a request, but a truth waiting to be accepted. And when he looked back at the rider, the weight of that understanding settled into him. Not heavy, not crushing, but steady, like something finally finding its place. And he realized then that this was not the moment of conflict he had expected, not the arrival of trouble to be pushed away or survived, but something else entirely, something quieter, something that did not need force to make itself known. And the rider waited, not impatient, not pressing, just present. And Ethan stood there on his porch, between the life he had built in silence and the one that had just stepped into it without asking. And for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to turn away from it. The rider did not move, and that was the first thing Ethan understood, not the horse, not the figure, but the stillness, the kind that came from someone who had nothing to prove and nowhere else to be. And it settled over the land like a second night, quiet and absolute. And Ethan stood on the porch, the boards warm beneath his boots from the day's heat still clinging to them, feeling the weight of that silent stretch between them, not tense, not threatening, just present, like a question that did not need to be asked out loud. And the rider's eyes, dark in the low light, rested on him with a calm that felt older than the moment itself. And for a second, Ethan had the strange thought that this man was not here to take anything, not land, not answers, not even control, but to witness something already in motion. And the idea sat heavy in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. Because Ethan Cole had spent years believing that nothing happened without reason he could understand, without cause he could trace. And yet here he stood, facing something that refused to explain itself. And behind him, the soft creak of the cabin door shifting in the wind reminded him that he was not alone in this. Not anymore. And he did not turn, did not need to, because he could feel her there, just inside, the same way he could feel the presence of the rider before him, steady, grounded, certain. And it struck him then that both of them carried that same quiet certainty, as if they were parts of the same story told from different ends. And he found himself speaking before he had decided to, his voice low, even, shaped by habit more than intent. "You come a long way for a man who does not know you." And the words hung in the air, simple, direct, the kind that usually demanded an answer, but the rider only tilted his head slightly, considering, not dismissing, and then he spoke again, this time in careful English. Each word measured, deliberate. He knows enough, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just enough to shift the ground beneath Ethan's feet in a way he could not ignore, because there was truth in it, whether he liked it or not, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting for a moment past the rider to the dark stretch of land beyond, where the horizon had disappeared into night, and he realized that the world out there, the one he had walked away from, the one filled with towns and men and choices, felt farther away now than it ever had, and the space between that life and this moment seemed to close in on him, narrowing until there was only this porch, this rider, and the presence behind him that refused to leave, and he shifted his stance slightly, not defensive, not open, just adjusting to the weight of it all, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something quieter, something closer to the truth he had been avoiding. She brought this here. And it was not an accusation, not really, just an acknowledgement of the way things had changed the second she stepped onto his land, and the rider's gaze flicked past him briefly, toward the doorway. And there was something in that glance that felt like recognition, not of Ethan, but of her, of what she carried, of what she represented, and it confirmed what Ethan had begun to suspect, that this was never just about shelter, never just about a night's rest, and the rider nodded once, slow, deliberate, and said, "She carries what was given." And again, the words were simple, but they landed with a weight that did not belong to their size, and Ethan felt that thread tighten again, pulling at something deep inside him, something he had kept locked away for years, and he did not like the direction it was pulling, not at all, and for a moment, he considered ending it, closing the door, sending them all away, reclaiming the quiet he had built so carefully. But the thought did not hold, not the way it used to, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because it meant that whatever this was, it had already changed him in ways he did not fully understand, and behind him, a soft sound broke through his thoughts, small, almost lost in the night, and he turned just enough to see the child standing in the doorway now, the blanket slipping slightly from their shoulders, the silver pendant resting against their chest once more, and in the dim light spilling from the cabin, it caught just enough to glimmer again, faint but undeniable, and the rider's eyes followed it immediately, drawn to it with the same quiet intensity Ethan had felt earlier, and for the first time, something shifted in the rider's expression, not surprise, not concern, but recognition, deep and certain, and he inclined his head again, this time not to Ethan, but to the child, a gesture of respect that felt deliberate, meaningful, and it sent a ripple through Ethan that he could not ignore, because respect like that was not given lightly, not out here, not between strangers, and it made him look at the child differently, not just as someone needing protection, but as someone carrying something larger than themselves, something that had brought all of this into motion. And the woman stepped into the doorway then, her presence filling the space behind the child without overshadowing it, her eyes moving from the rider to Ethan, steady, unwavering. And in that look, there was no question, no hesitation, just a quiet insistence that whatever choice needed to be made had already been made, and Ethan felt it settle into him, not as pressure, not as force, but as something inevitable, like the turning of the seasons or the slow shift of land underfoot, and he turned back to the rider, the night stretching wide around them, and for the first time since this began, he understood that this was not a moment to resist, not a moment to fight or to flee, but a moment to stand in, to accept, to let whatever was unfolding take its course, and the realization did not bring peace, not yet, but it brought clarity, and in the quiet that followed, with the firelight behind him and the open land before him, Ethan Cole stood at the edge of a life he had never planned for, and did not step away. The night did not move, and that was what made it feel heavier, as if everything had paused just long enough for Ethan to understand that this was no longer a moment passing through his life, but something settling into it, something choosing to stay, and he stood there on the porch with the rider before him and the quiet presence behind him, feeling that shift take hold in a way he could not ignore, and for the first time in years, he did not look for a way out of it, did not search for distance or escape. He simply stood, breathing slow, steady, letting the silence speak in ways words never could, and the rider remained still in the saddle, his posture unchanged, his gaze calm, but there was something in his eyes now that had not been there before, something softer, not in weakness, but in recognition, like a man who had come far enough to know when something had already been decided long before he arrived. And Ethan understood that, too, without needing it explained, because he could feel it in the ground beneath his boots, in the way the air seemed to hold its shape instead of drifting away, in the way the woman behind him had not once asked for permission to stay, only stated what would be, and that kind of certainty did not come from hope. It came from knowing, and knowing had a weight that could not be argued with. And he let his gaze shift back toward the doorway, just for a second, enough to see the child standing there with the blanket wrapped loosely around their shoulders, the silver pendant resting quiet and still against their chest, no longer catching the light, no longer demanding attention, and somehow that made it feel even more important, like something that had already spoken and was now waiting to be understood. And the woman stood just behind the child, her hand resting lightly on their shoulder, her eyes steady on Ethan. And in that look there was no urgency, no fear, only patience, the kind that came from someone who had already walked this path in their mind and was simply waiting for him to catch up. And Ethan felt a faint, unfamiliar pull in his chest, not the sharp edge of danger, not the tight grip of fear, but something quieter, something closer to belonging. And it unsettled him more than anything else, because belonging was not something he had allowed himself in a long time. Not since he had chosen this land, this distance, this silence, and yet here it was, standing in his doorway, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply existing until he acknowledged it. And he turned back to the rider, his voice low, measured, shaped by something deeper than habit now. "You came to take them?" And the question hung in the air, simple, direct, but carrying more than it said, because it was not just about the woman and the child. It was about whether this moment would end the way he expected it to, whether the world would return to something familiar once they were gone. And the rider watched him for a long second before answering. And when he did, his voice carried that same steady calm. "No one takes what has already found its place." And the words settled into Ethan like a stone dropped into still water, sending quiet ripples outward that touched every part of him, because there was truth in them, a truth he had been circling since the moment the woman first appeared at his door. And he felt something inside him give way, not break, not fall apart, but shift, like a door he had kept closed finally opening just enough to let something new in. And he exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him heavier than it should have. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but clearer. "And what is that place?" And the rider did not answer right away, his gaze drifting past Ethan once more, toward the doorway, toward the child, toward the woman, and then back to him. And when he finally spoke, it was not to explain, not to define, but to confirm what Ethan already knew, where it is chosen. And that was all, and somehow it was enough, because Ethan felt the truth of it settle into him in a way no explanation could have. And he realized then that this was not about obligation, not about debt, not about something owed or something taken. It was about choice, about what a man decided to stand for when the moment came, about whether he stepped forward or stepped away. And he turned slightly, just enough to look fully at the woman now, at the way she stood there without asking, without pleading, simply present, and the child beside her, steady, quiet, holding that small silver piece of something that connected past to present in a way he could no longer deny. And the thought came to him, then, clear and unshaken, that they had not come here by chance, that whatever had started years ago, whatever he had thought finished, had found its way back to him through them, not to demand, not to accuse, but to offer something he had not allowed himself to consider. And he felt that unfamiliar pull again, stronger now, but no longer unsettling, no longer something to resist. And he turned back toward the rider, meeting his gaze without hesitation, and there was a quiet understanding between them now, unspoken but complete. And Ethan gave a small nod, not to the rider, not entirely, but to the moment itself, to the choice that had been waiting for him since the door first opened. And behind him, the fire crackled softly, the only sound in a world that had gone still just long enough for everything to fall into place. And Ethan Cole stepped back from the edge of the porch, not retreating, not withdrawing, but making room for what had already chosen to stay. The rider did not stay longer than the moment required. And that was how Ethan knew this was never about the rider at all. Because after that quiet exchange, after the words that carried more weight than they should have, the man simply inclined his head once more, turned his horse with a calm, practiced motion, and rode off into the night without looking back. The sound of hooves fading into the distance until it became part of the same silence it had once broken, and Ethan stood there for a few seconds longer, watching the dark where the rider had been, not expecting him to return, not needing him to, because whatever purpose he had served had already been fulfilled, and the land seemed to breathe again, the tension easing, the air moving freely where before it had held still, and Ethan turned slowly, stepping back inside the cabin, the door closing behind him with a softer sound this time, as if the place itself had accepted the change that had just taken root, and inside, the fire still burned low and steady, casting long shadows across the walls, and the woman had not moved far from where she had been, her presence as grounded as before, but there was something different now, something almost imperceptible, a slight easing in the way she held herself, like a weight had shifted from one side to another, not gone, but balanced, and the child had moved closer to the table, sitting quietly, small hands resting in their lap, the silver pendant now lying still against their chest, no longer a signal, no longer a question, but something that simply existed, waiting, and Ethan took a few steps into the room, stopping near the center, not quite knowing where to place himself now that everything had changed without anything obvious happening, and that unfamiliar feeling settled again, that sense of standing in something new without a clear direction forward, and he cleared his throat lightly, the sound grounding him just enough to speak. He was not from town, and it was not a question, not really, just a statement meant to fill the space, to bring something back into words where silence had taken over, and the woman nodded once, her eyes steady on him, and for the first time, there was something softer in her gaze, not warmth exactly, but a kind of quiet acknowledgement, like she recognized the shift in him as clearly as he was beginning to feel it, and she said, "No," simple, certain, and that was all, and Ethan let out a slow breath, running a hand along the edge of the table, feeling the worn wood beneath his fingers, something solid, something unchanged, and he realized then that while the world outside might remain the same, something inside this cabin had already crossed a line it could not return from, and he glanced toward the child, who was now looking up at him, not with curiosity, not with uncertainty, but with that same steady awareness he had seen before. And it struck him again how unusual that was, how different from what he would expect from someone so young. And yet there it was, clear as day, and the child lifted a hand slowly, fingers curling around the pendant before holding it out slightly, not offering it, not giving it away, but showing it, like a piece of a story that had not yet been told, and Ethan felt that pull again, stronger now, undeniable, and this time he did not turn away from it, did not push it aside. He stepped closer instead, slow, deliberate, until he stood just a few feet from them, his eyes fixed on the small piece of silver that had somehow found its way back into his life. And for a moment, the room seemed to narrow around that single object, the firelight dimming, the edges of the world fading, leaving only the memory it carried. And he could see it now, clearer than before, not just the shape, but the meaning behind it, the moment it had last been in his hands, the reason he had let it go, and the weight of that memory settled into him with a quiet certainty that made his chest tighten, and he reached out, not to take it, not yet, but close enough to feel its presence, and the child did not pull back, did not hesitate, simply held it there, steady, waiting, and behind them, the woman watched her, expression unreadable, but her eyes holding that same quiet insistence, that same understanding that this was the moment he had been circling since the beginning, and Ethan's fingers hovered just short of the pendant, the distance between them small, but significant, because crossing it meant more than touching metal, it meant acknowledging everything that came with it, everything he had left behind, everything that had now returned. And he hesitated for just a second, not out of fear, but out of recognition of what that step meant, and then, slowly, he closed the distance, his fingers brushing lightly against the cool surface of the silver, and the contact sent a quiet ripple through him, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like something finally settling into place after being out of reach for too long. And he exhaled softly, his hand lowering back to his side. But the connection remained, not physical now, but something deeper, something that tied him to the moment in a way he could not undo. And he looked up at the woman, meeting her gaze fully for the first time without resistance, without distance. And in that look, there was no question left, no uncertainty, only a quiet acceptance of what had already begun. And the fire cracked softly behind them, the only sound in a room that had just become something more than it had ever been before. And Ethan Cole understood, without needing it spoken, that the life he had built in silence had just opened itself to something he could not turn away from anymore. The room stayed quiet long after his fingers left the silver, but it was not the same silence as before. It had weight now, shape, like something invisible had settled between them and refused to move. And Ethan stood there, his hand lowering slowly to his side, feeling the echo of that small contact still lingering in his chest, steady and undeniable. And for the first time in a long while, he did not try to push it away, did not try to bury it under routine or distance. He simply let it remain, and the child watched him with that same calm, knowing gaze, as if they had been waiting for that exact moment, not for him to take the pendant, not for him to claim it, but for him to recognize it, to accept what it meant without needing. It explained, and that understanding settled deeper than any words could have, and Ethan let out a slow breath, turning slightly toward the fire, not to leave the moment behind, but to give it space to breathe. And the soft crackle of burning wood filled the room again, grounding everything in something familiar, something simple, and yet even that felt different now, as if the fire itself burned with a quieter purpose, no longer just heat, but witness. And behind him, he could feel the woman's presence shift, not in movement, but in energy, a subtle change that told him she had been watching every part of that exchange, not judging, not guiding, just observing with a patience that stretched far beyond the moment. And when he glanced back at her, their eyes met again. And this time there was something new there, not just certainty, but a kind of quiet relief, like a step had been taken that she had known would come, even if he had not. And it made him wonder how long she had been carrying that certainty, how far she had traveled with it, not in miles, but in intention. And the thought settled into him with a weight he could not ignore, because it meant this was never just about finding shelter, never just about escaping whatever had followed them here. It was about arriving, about reaching a place that had been chosen long before he understood why. And the idea should have unsettled him, should have pushed him back into the distance he had built so carefully, but it did not anymore. And that realization surprised him more than anything else, because it meant something inside him had already begun to change, quietly, without permission. And he moved toward the table slowly, his steps measured, his mind still catching up to the shift that had taken hold. And he rested his hands against the worn wood, grounding himself again in something solid, something known. And for a moment, he simply stood there, looking at the grain of the table, the marks left by years of use, the small imperfections that told the story of time passing without interruption. And it struck him then how different that was from what had just happened, how this place, this life, had been built on the idea of stillness, of keeping things unchanged, predictable, controlled. And yet all it had taken was one night, one knock that never came, one woman and one child stepping into his world without asking. And everything had shifted in a way he could not reverse. And he lifted his gaze again, looking toward the door, half expecting to see the rider return, to hear the sound of hooves cutting through the quiet once more. But there was nothing. Just the dark stretch of land beyond, calm, undisturbed, as if nothing had happened at all. And that, more than anything, made him understand that this was not something that would be resolved in a single moment, not something that would come and go like trouble usually did. This was something that would remain, that would take root and grow in ways he could not yet see. And the child shifted slightly then, stepping closer to the table, the blanket slipping from one shoulder. And without thinking, Ethan reached out, adjusting it gently, the motion simple, almost automatic. And the child did not pull away, did not react with surprise, just accepted it, as if it had always been his place to do so. And that small moment settled into him with a quiet finality, because it was not about the gesture itself, it was about what it meant, about the way it came without hesitation, without resistance. And he realized then that this was how it began. Not with grand decisions or spoken promises, but with small, steady actions that slowly built. Something larger than either of them had planned. And he glanced toward the woman again, and she saw it. Of course she did. The shift, the acceptance, the way his movements had changed, and she gave a small nod, not of approval, not of thanks, but of recognition, as if to say that this was what had been waiting all along. And Ethan felt that same quiet certainty settle into him once more, deeper now, more rooted, and he turned his attention back to the room, to the fire, to the child standing close by. And he spoke, his voice low, steady, no longer uncertain. "You will stay here tonight." And it was not a question, not an offer, but a statement, simple and clear. And the woman did not answer right away. She only held his gaze for a long second before nodding. Once, and in that nod, there was an understanding that reached beyond the words, something unspoken but fully acknowledged, and the fire crackled again, the only sound in a space that had begun to feel less like a place of solitude and more like the beginning of something Ethan Cole had not expected to find again and did not turn away from. The fire burned lower as the night stretched deeper, and the kind of quiet that followed was no longer heavy with questions but settled with something steadier, something that did not need to prove itself. And Ethan moved slowly around the room, not out of habit, not out of routine, but because he was learning the shape of this new silence, the way it held more than just himself now. And he reached for another piece of wood, placing it carefully into the fire, watching as the flames caught. Again, rising just enough to push back the dark corners of the cabin. And in that soft light, everything looked different, not changed in form, but in meaning. The table, the chair, the walls he had built with his own hands, they no longer felt like barriers, they felt like something shared, and that realization settled into him with a quiet weight he did not resist. And behind him, the child had moved closer to the fire again, sitting cross-legged now, the blanket wrapped tighter, the silver pendant resting still, no longer reaching outward, no longer asking to be seen. And Ethan found himself watching that small detail, the way the child's fingers occasionally brushed against it without thinking, like it was not just something worn but something remembered. And he wondered, not for the first time, what story it carried, what path had brought it here, and why it had found its way back to him after all these years. And the thought lingered, not sharp, not pressing, but steady, like a question that would answer itself when the time came. And the woman stood near the doorway still, not guarding it, not blocking it, just present, her posture relaxed in a way it had not been before, her shoulders no longer carrying that same quiet tension. And Ethan noticed that too, the way her breathing had slowed, the way her gaze no longer scanned the room but rested instead, like someone who had reached a place she trusted, even if only for now. And that trust, small as it was, settled into him with more weight than anything else, because it was not something he had asked for, not something he had earned in the ways he understood. It was simply given, and that kind of trust demanded something in return, not words, not promises, but presence. And he felt that realization take hold in him, deeper than any thought, shaping the way he stood, the way he moved, the way he looked at them. Now, and he stepped toward the small shelf near the wall, reaching for a tin cup, filling it with water from the jug, and he set it down near the child without a word. And the child looked up at him, not surprised, not hesitant, just aware. And after a second, they reached for it, taking a small sip, their movements calm, steady. And Ethan realized that even this simple act felt different, not an obligation, not a duty, but something natural, something that belonged in the space between them. Now, and he leaned back slightly against the wall, his arms resting loosely at his sides, and for a moment, he simply watched the fire again, letting the rhythm of it settle into him, the quiet rise and fall of the flames matching the slow shift happening inside him. And he thought about the writer, about the words that had been spoken, about the way the man had left without taking anything, without asking for anything. And it struck him then that this had never been about outside forces, never about threats or pursuit. It had always been about what stood inside this room, about the choices made here, the connections formed here. And that understanding brought a kind of clarity he had not felt in years, a clarity that did not come from knowing everything, but from accepting what he did know. And he turned his head slightly, looking toward the woman again, and this time, When their eyes met, there was no distance left, no hesitation, just a quiet acknowledgement of what had already begun, and she stepped forward then, just a single step, enough to close the space between them slightly, and she spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying that same calm certainty as before. Morning will change things, and Ethan held her gaze, considering the weight of those words, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple truth, and he nodded once, slowly, because he understood that, too, that whatever had begun here would not stay contained within these walls, that the world outside would eventually press in, as it always did. But for now, for this moment, it did not matter, and he said quietly, "Then we meet it when it comes." And the words settled into the room like something solid, something real. And the woman did not respond with words. She only held his gaze for a moment longer before turning slightly, guiding the child toward the corner where the bed rested, her movements calm, deliberate, and the child followed without question, settling down beneath the blanket with the same quiet acceptance they had shown all night. And Ethan remained where he stood, watching as they found their place within his space, not as guests, not as strangers, but as something else entirely, something that had not yet been named. And as the fire burned steady and the night stretched on outside, he realized that the life he had built in solitude had already begun to make room for something more, not through force, not through demand, but through the simple act of allowing it. And that was something he had never done before, not until now. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like it was unsure whether it should disturb what had taken root during the night. And Ethan felt it before he saw it, that subtle shift in the air, the way the darkness thinned just enough to let the first pale light slip through the cracks in the wood. And he was already awake, though he did not remember closing his eyes, his body resting but his mind never fully leaving the space he now shared. And he sat quietly in the chair near the fire, the embers glowing low and steady, their warmth softer now, more constant. And for a long moment he did not move, did not speak. He simply listened, to the quiet breathing in the corner of the room, to the faint sound of wind brushing against the land outside, to the absence of anything that felt like danger. And that absence told him more than anything else, because it meant the night had passed without interruption, without the return of hooves, without the weight of something pressing against his door. And that alone should have brought relief, should have returned him to the life he knew. But it did not entirely, because the presence in the room had not left, and neither had the change it had brought with it. And he shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze moving toward the corner where they rested, and the child was still wrapped in the blanket, breathing slow and even, the silver pendant resting against their chest, catching the faintest trace of morning light as it slipped in. And the woman sat beside them, not asleep, not fully, but resting in a way that spoke of awareness even in stillness, her eyes opening as soon as Ethan's gaze settled on her. And for a second, neither of them spoke, the kind of silence that no longer felt unfamiliar, but shared. And Ethan rose slowly from his chair, his movements quiet, deliberate, and he stepped toward the window, pushing it open just enough to let the cool morning air in, and the scent of dry earth and distant grass filled the room, carrying with it the promise of a new day, one that would not look the same as the last. And he glanced out across the land, the horizon stretching wide and clear, no riders, no dust, nothing to suggest that anything had disturbed the stillness of the night. And yet he knew better now, knew that not all changes left marks on the ground. Some settled deeper, inside a man, inside a place. And he turned back into the room, the light now stronger, revealing more of what had quietly shifted while the world slept. And the woman had risen to her feet, moving with that same calm certainty, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder as they stirred, waking slowly, not startled, not confused, just aware. And Ethan watched that small exchange, the way the child looked up at her, the way she met that look without words. And something in that moment settled into him with a clarity he could not ignore, because it was not something he had built, not something he had chosen, but something he was now part of, whether he understood it fully or not. And he moved toward the table again, reaching for another cup, filling it with water, placing it down within their reach. And the gesture felt as natural as breathing, no longer something he questioned, no longer something he held back. And the child took it with a small nod, drinking quietly, while the woman's gaze remained on Ethan, steady, measuring not his actions, but the meaning behind them. And after a moment, she spoke, her voice soft but clear in the morning light. "It begins now." And Ethan paused, the words settling into him with a weight that felt different from the night before, not uncertain, not questioning, but grounded, real, and he let out a slow breath, nodding once, because he understood, not every detail, not every path ahead, but the truth of what she meant, that whatever had started the moment he opened that door had not ended with the night. It had carried through into this morning, into whatever came next, and he stepped toward the door, opening it wide this time, letting the full light of day spill into the cabin, and, for a moment, he simply stood there, looking out at the land that had been his alone for so long. The fences, the barn, the wide stretch of open space that had once meant distance, solitude, control, and now felt different, not smaller, not taken, but shared in a way he had never allowed before. And he glanced back over his shoulder, meeting the woman's eyes again, and there was something unspoken in that look, something that did not need to be explained, because it had already been accepted. And he stepped outside, the morning air cool against his skin, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, and he knew, without needing to say it out loud, that whatever this day brought, whatever the world outside decided to press against his door, he would not face it alone, not anymore. And that realization did not feel like a burden, not like something forced upon him, but like something chosen, something he had stepped into the moment he stopped turning away, and behind him, he could hear them moving inside, not as strangers passing through, but as part of the space itself. And Ethan Cole stood there in the morning light, feeling the land beneath his feet, the weight of the day ahead, and the quiet certainty that the life he had known was no longer the only one waiting for him. The sun climbed slowly, stretching light across the land in long, pale lines, and Ethan stood just beyond the porch, watching the way it touched everything it reached, the fence posts, the dry grass, the barn that had not seen another soul in months, maybe years, and for the first time, it did not feel like his alone. It felt like something that had been waiting, not for ownership, but for presence. And he rested his hand lightly against the porch rail, the wood warm under his palm, grounding him in the moment. And behind him, the soft sound of footsteps on the cabin floor reached him, steady, unhurried, and he did not turn right away, not because he did not care, but because he already knew who it was, and that knowing came without tension now, without resistance, and that alone told him how much had changed. And after a second, he stepped down from the porch, boots meeting the dry earth with a quiet firmness, and he walked a few steps into the open, his gaze scanning the horizon, out of habit, not expecting anything, but no longer ignoring the world beyond his walls. And the air was still, calm, carrying only the faint movement of wind through distant brush, and no sign of riders, no sign of interruption, just the wide, open stretch of land that had always been there, unchanged, and yet not the same. And he let out a slow breath, feeling the space around him expand in a way it had not before, not because it had grown larger, but because he was no longer holding himself apart from it. And he heard her step onto the porch behind him, her presence settling into the space without disturbing it. And when he turned, she was standing there, the morning light catching in her hair, her posture steady, grounded, and the child stood just behind her, small, quiet, the silver pendant resting against their chest like it belonged there, like it had always belonged there. And Ethan looked at them both, really looked this time, not as strangers, not as visitors, but as something that had crossed into his life and stayed, and the thought no longer unsettled him. It settled him instead, like a piece of something finally fitting where it had always been meant to go. And he spoke, his voice low, even, carrying the weight of the morning with it. "There is work to do." And the words were simple, but they held more than just their meaning. They carried an invitation, a recognition that this place was no longer just his to move through alone. And the woman watched him for a moment, her eyes searching his face, not for doubt, not for hesitation, but for truth. And whatever she found there seemed to be enough, because she nodded once, slow, deliberate, and stepped down from the porch, moving past him without pause, without question, as if she already understood what needed to be done. And the child followed, staying close, their small steps steady, sure, and Ethan felt that same quiet shift again, not in the land, not in the air, but in himself, the way his movements adjusted to include them, the way his attention no longer split between inside and outside, but held both at once, and he led them toward the fence line, his pace unhurried, his eyes scanning the posts, the wire, the small details that had once been his only concern, and as they walked, the morning unfolded around them, the light growing stronger, the air warming just enough to carry the scent of dry grass and distant earth, and for a while, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no need to fill the space with words, and that silence felt different now, shared, understood, and when they reached the first stretch of fence, Ethan paused, resting a hand on one of the posts, feeling the rough texture beneath his fingers, and he glanced back at them, the woman standing a few steps behind, the child at her side, both watching, not waiting for instruction, but for direction, and he gestured lightly toward the line. This needs to hold. And it was not a command, not a test, just a statement of what mattered. And the woman stepped forward without hesitation, her hands moving to the wire, checking its tension, its placement, her movements sure, practiced, as if she had done this before, perhaps not here, perhaps not with him, but somewhere, sometime, and Ethan watched that for a second, the way she worked without needing guidance, the way the child observed, learning, without being told, and something in that small scene settled into him with a quiet certainty, because this was how it began, not with declarations, not with promises, but with shared work, shared space, shared purpose, and he found himself moving alongside them, adjusting a post, tightening a line, his hands working as they always had, but with a different awareness now, a sense that what he was maintaining was no longer just his own. And the hours moved slowly, steadily, the sun climbing higher, the land warming under its light, and through it all, the rhythm of their movements held, simple, consistent, grounded, and at one point, the child stepped closer to him, holding out a small piece of wire, offering it without a word, and Ethan took it, his fingers brushing lightly against theirs, and for a brief second, that same quiet connection passed between them again, not forced, not questioned, just there, and he nodded once, small, almost instinctive, and the child returned it, with the same steady calm. And as the morning stretched on, Ethan realized that this was the change the woman had spoken of, not something loud, not something sudden, but something built in small moments, in shared effort, in the simple act of standing side by side and choosing not to turn away. And when he finally straightened, looking out across the land that now held more than just himself, he understood, without needing it spoken, that whatever lay ahead, whatever the world might bring to his door, it would meet something different than it had before, because Ethan Cole was no longer standing there alone. By midday the sun had settled high and steady, pressing warmth into the land without urgency, and the rhythm they had found that morning did not break. It deepened, like something learning how to exist without needing to be explained, and Ethan stood near the far end of the fence line, wiping a trace of dust from his hands as he looked out across the stretch of open ground. The kind of view he had seen 1,000 times before and never really looked at. Not like this. Not with the awareness that it was no longer something he stood apart from. And behind him, he could hear the faint sound of movement, the soft shift of boots against dry earth, the quiet presence of two people who had not left, who had not questioned, who had simply stayed. And that simple truth settled into him with a weight that felt steady, not heavy, something that held rather than pressed, and he turned slightly, watching as the child knelt near one of the posts, carefully gathering a loose piece of wire that had fallen, small fingers working with focus that did not belong to someone so young. And the woman stood nearby, not correcting, not guiding, only watching with a calm that trusted the moment to unfold as it should, and Ethan found himself studying that. The way she allowed space without stepping away, the way she remained present without taking control, and it reminded him of something he could not quite name, something from long before he chose this life of distance, something about how strength did not always come from holding on, but from knowing when not to interfere, and the thought stayed with him longer than he expected, because it was not something he had practiced, not something he had allowed himself to learn, and yet here it was, taking shape in front of him without effort, and he stepped closer, resting a hand on the fence post the child had been working on, feeling its firmness, its stability, and he gave it a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else. And the child looked up at him, not seeking approval, not waiting for praise, just acknowledging the shared moment. And that was enough, more than enough, and Ethan straightened slowly, his gaze moving back across the land. And for a brief second, he caught something at the edge of the horizon, not movement, not clearly, but a shift in light, a faint disruption in the stillness that did not belong to wind or distance. And his body reacted before his thoughts did, his posture adjusting slightly, his focus narrowing just enough to mark it. And he did not speak right away, did not call it out, because he had learned the difference between reacting and observing. And this was something to be observed, not feared, not yet. And the woman noticed, of course she did, her gaze following his without question, without asking what he saw. And in that silent exchange, there was an understanding that did not need words, because she already knew the world did not stay still forever, that what had begun here would eventually be seen from beyond it. And the child stood then, brushing their hands lightly against their clothes, the silver pendant catching the midday light for just a moment before settling again. And Ethan watched that brief flicker, the way it still pulled at something in him. But now without confusion, without resistance, just recognition. And he exhaled slowly, turning his attention back to the present, to the fence, to the land beneath his feet, to the two people who had become part of it. And he spoke, his voice calm, grounded. We finish this line before the sun drops. And it was not urgency, not pressure, just direction, something shared, something that moved them forward together. And the woman nodded once, stepping into place beside him, her hands moving to the wire again, steady, precise. And the child followed without hesitation, their small movements fitting naturally into the rhythm they had already begun to build. And as the hours passed, the light shifted, slowly, stretching shadows longer across the ground, and the land seemed to breathe with them. Each step, each motion adding to something that had not existed before this day. And Ethan felt it in the way his thoughts no longer circled back to solitude, in the way his attention no longer pulled inward, but outward, toward them, toward the shared space they were shaping without needing to define it. And at one point, as he adjusted another post, his hand slipped slightly against the rough wood. And before he could steady himself, the woman's hand was there, not grabbing, not forcing, just present, offering balance without taking it. And he paused for a second, meeting her eyes. And there was something in that moment that went beyond the action itself, something that spoke of trust given and accepted without hesitation. And he nodded once, small, acknowledging not the help, but what it meant. And she returned it just as quietly. And the moment passed without needing to be held onto. And when the final stretch of wire was secured, when the last post stood firm against the weight of the line, Ethan stepped back, looking at the work in front of them, not as something completed, but as something shared, something that now carried more than just function. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that came from effort, from presence, from being part of something that did not exist the day before. And as the sun began its slow descent, casting the land in a softer light, he realized that whatever had begun the night before had already taken root in ways that could not be undone. And for the first time in a long while, that did not feel like something to guard against. It felt like something worth standing for. The light began to soften as the sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the land they had just worked. And Ethan stood still for a moment, looking at the fence line, not just seeing the posts and wire, but the quiet imprint of what had been done together, something steady, something real. And the air carried a different weight now, not heavy, not tense, but full, like the land itself had taken notice of the change that had settled into it. And he let his gaze drift once more toward the horizon, toward that faint shift he had seen earlier. And this time it was clearer, not movement in the way of urgency, but presence, distant figures, small against the wide stretch of earth, approaching slowly, not hidden, not rushing, just coming. And Ethan did not tense, did not step back. He simply watched, his posture steady, grounded, and behind him, he felt the woman's attention shift again, aligning with his without needing to ask. And the child stood quietly beside her, the silver pendant catching the last light of the afternoon. And for a moment, All three of them stood in that shared stillness, watching what approached without fear, without uncertainty, because whatever this was, it did not carry the sharp edge of threat. It carried something else, something closer to inevitability, and Ethan took a slow breath, the kind that settled deep, and he turned slightly, looking at the woman, meeting her eyes fully, and there was no question there, no doubt, only a quiet confirmation of what they both understood, that this moment was not the breaking of what had begun, but the revealing of it. And he spoke, his voice calm. Even, they are coming for you. And the words were simple, not accusatory, not protective, just an acknowledgement of what stood before them. And the woman shook her head once, slow, certain, and her voice carried that same steady clarity it always had. They are coming because of you. And that settled into Ethan with a weight that did not press him down, but anchored him, because in that moment, he understood something he had not fully allowed himself to see before, that this was not about them arriving at his door, it was about him opening it, about the choice he had made without fully realizing its reach. And he turned back toward the horizon, the figures now clearer, a small group, moving with the same measured pace as the rider from the night before, not aggressive, not uncertain, just present, and the land between them closed slowly, not in distance, but in meaning, and Ethan felt no urge to prepare for confrontation, no instinct to retreat, only the steady awareness that whatever came next would meet him where he stood, and he stepped forward, just a few paces, leaving the fence line behind, placing himself in the open space between the approaching figures and the cabin, not as a barrier, not as a guard, but as someone who had chosen where he stood, and behind him. The woman did not move to stop him, did not step ahead. She simply remained where she was, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder, her presence steady, grounded, and the child watched, not with fear, not with confusion, but with that same quiet understanding that had been there from the beginning. And as the figures drew closer, their forms became clearer, not strangers in the way Ethan had once defined them, but people who carried something familiar in the way they moved, in the way they held themselves, something that connected them to the woman, to the child, to the story that had brought them here. And the lead figure slowed first, bringing the others to a stop several yards away, a respectful distance, not crossing into his space, not claiming it. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of recognition, of understanding that did not need to be spoken, and Ethan stood there, meeting their presence without hesitation, his posture steady, his gaze clear, and for a moment, nothing moved, nothing needed to, and then the lead figure inclined their head slightly, a gesture that mirrored the one from the night before. And in that small motion, everything settled into place, the meaning of the pendant, the reason for the arrival, the quiet certainty the woman had carried from the beginning, and Ethan felt it all align within him, not as something overwhelming, but as something complete, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back at the woman and the child, and in that look, there was no question left, no uncertainty, only a shared understanding that this was not an ending, not a moment of separation, but a moment of recognition, of something being acknowledged by the world beyond the small space they had created. And he faced forward again, the last light of the day settling over the land. And he did not speak, did not need to, because his presence, his choice, his willingness to stand there without turning away, said everything that mattered. And in that quiet, steady moment, the distance between worlds did not feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like something that had already been crossed. The last light of the day lingered just long enough to soften the edges of everything, the land, the figures, the space between them, and Ethan stood where he had chosen to stand, not moving forward, not stepping back, simply present, and the group before him remained still as well, their distance unchanged, their posture calm, and in that shared stillness, something passed between them that did not need words, something older than language, something built on recognition rather than explanation, and the lead figure took one step forward, slow, deliberate, closing just enough of the space to be seen clearly, and Ethan watched, not with suspicion, not with readiness, but with the quiet attention of someone who understood that this moment was not about what might happen, but about what had already been decided. And the man's gaze shifted briefly past him, toward the cabin, toward the woman and the child standing just within. the reach of the fading light. And there was no surprise in that look, no confusion, only a steady acknowledgement, like someone who had expected to find exactly what was there. And Ethan followed that glance for just a second, looking back at them, and the woman stood as she always had, grounded, certain, her hand resting lightly on the child's shoulder, and the child stood without fear, the silver pendant catching the last thread of sunlight before the shadows took it. And in that small detail, everything seemed to settle, the meaning of it, the path it had taken, the reason it had returned, and Ethan felt that quiet understanding reach its final place within him, not as a question anymore, not as something unresolved, but as something complete. And when he turned back to face the figures, there was no hesitation left in him, no distance to maintain, only the steady presence of a man who had chosen where he stood and would not move from it. And the lead figure inclined his head again, deeper this time, not just acknowledgement, but respect, and Ethan returned it, not out of habit, not out of courtesy, but because it felt right, because it matched what had been built here. And for a moment longer, no one spoke, no one needed to, the air itself carrying the understanding between them. And then, slowly, the figures began to step back, not turning away in haste, not leaving in uncertainty, but retreating with the same calm they had arrived with, as if their purpose had been fulfilled simply by coming, simply by seeing, simply by recognizing what had taken root on this land. And Ethan watched them go, not with relief, not with concern, but with a quiet acceptance that this was how it was meant to unfold, that nothing needed to be taken, nothing needed to be proven, because what mattered had already been established. And when they had disappeared into the fading light, when the land returned to its open stillness, he remained where he was for a few seconds longer, letting the moment settle fully, letting the last of it pass through him without resistance. And then he turned, slowly, deliberately, walking back toward the cabin, toward the place that no longer felt like something he stood apart from, but something he was part of. And the woman met him halfway, her steps quiet, her presence steady, and they stopped a few feet from each other, close enough to see the details in each other's expression, the subtle changes that had taken place without words. And for a second, they simply looked at one another, not as strangers, not as two lives crossing briefly, but as something else entirely, something that had found its place without asking permission. And Ethan spoke then, his voice low, carrying the calm certainty that had settled into him. "They did not come to take you." And the woman shook her head once, her eyes holding his without wavering, and she answered just as quietly, "No, they came to see if you would stay." And the words settled into him with a finality that did not press, did not demand, but simply existed as truth. And he let out a slow breath, the kind that marked the end of something and the beginning of something else. And he nodded once, not to her, not entirely, but to the moment itself, to the path that had unfolded without his understanding and now stood clear before him. And he turned slightly, glancing toward the child, who stood just behind her, watching, quiet, steady, the silver pendant resting where it belonged, no longer a question, no longer a symbol of something unfinished, but a part of what had already been accepted. And Ethan felt a faint, unfamiliar warmth settle into his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but steady, like something that would remain. And he stepped past them, back toward the cabin, pushing the door open as the last of the lights slipped below the horizon. And he paused there, just for a second, looking back at them, not to check, not to question, but simply to see them where they stood. And then he stepped inside, leaving the door open behind him. And after a moment, they followed, not as guests, not as strangers passing through, but as something that had already become part of the space. And the fire inside still held its warmth, steady and quiet. And as the night settled once more over the land, there was no sense of something ending, no feeling of closure, only the calm understanding that what had begun here would not be undone, not by distance, not by time, because out here, where the land stretched wide, and the silence carried meaning deeper than words, some choices did not need to be spoken to be kept, and some bonds did not need to be named to be real. And Ethan Cole, standing in the quiet glow of the fire, knew without question that this was one of them.